Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became Shadows of Vigilance Part 1. If you guys enjoyed this what if and want to see Part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story vinbunny from AO3. So let's start the video. Don't worry about me, I know what I'm doing. It was the last thing Naomasa said before going undercover, his mission requiring absolute radio silence. That meant no contact between him and the precinct, or anyone else, for 3 weeks. All Might frowned as the detective traded in his personal cell for a brand new untraceable one. He was uneasy about every bit of the situation. The gang Naomasa was to infiltrate was known all throughout Japan. They worked in the shadows, selling arms to those without offensive quirks, and hallucinogenic drugs to even shadier customers. Anyone suspected of having traitorous thoughts would be silenced, and so the group was known as 𝐒𝐻𝐢. Many heroes tried to bring them down, only to be faced with their own deaths. Naomasa left late in the night with his usual smile. The precinct was quiet, only a few officers and his best friend there to see him off. There was no wind or any other notable feature to speak of, only strange silence. And so 1 week went by like normal. Then the next. On the second day of the final week, Toshinori heard a loud crash at his door. It woke him up with a start despite the ungodly hour. He stumbled through his home, cursing each time his foot caught on a stray edge of furniture. Swinging the door open, his eyes went wide in shock at the sight before him. Naomasa 𝗧𝗵𝗲, ragged breathing and a hand over his gut. Dark liquid stained his clothes and face. His body leaned against the outer wall of Toshinori's house, hardly looking like he could take another step. Hearing the click of the door, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 glanced up with a weak smile. Gee, Toshinori. Flecks of blood spilled from his mouth as he spoke. I'm back. A bit early. For a long second, a mix of shock and panic rooted Toshinori to the spot. He stood in the doorway, a white-knuckled grip on the doorknob, muscles tense as they've ever been on any battlefield. His might have stayed there forever. But then Naomasa's legs gave out from under him, and Toshinori instinctively moved to catch him before he hit the ground. The second his body moves, his mind shifts back online. It's both a blessing and a curse. Honestly, on one hand, he's been run through basic first aid courses so many times that he could probably provide medical assistance in his sleep. On the other hand, it feels like his brain's been kicked into its highest gear. He's hyper-aware of the slick feel of blood coating his side from where Naomasa leaned against him. He drags his friend inside, heading toward the kitchen on autopilot. He grabs the medkit he keeps under the sink and rips through it for anything that could be helpful: antiseptic, bandages, gauze. His fingers hover over the needle and thread uncertainly. If the wounds are bad enough to need sutures, he's beyond any aid Toshinori could safely provide. Toshinori cursed himself for leaving his phone on the bedside table. He wouldn't dare leave Naomasa alone as he is. But whatever happened means an ambulance would be necessary before the night was out. Toshinori snapped out of his internal debate when he heard a faint groan from behind him. Dilemma forgotten, or at least pushed aside. He grabbed the bandages and gauze and hurried back to Naomasa. He dropped to his knees in front of his injured friend, resting one hand against Naomasa's side to brace him where he was slumped against the kitchen table. His hand wets with blood worryingly quickly. Toshinori starts to strip the shirt off Naomasa's frame, hissing in time with his friend when the fabric catches against skin. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, man, what happened? He asks. Toshinori's outline was somewhat blurry, his dashing about the kitchen not doing much for Naomasa's ability to focus. He could feel the pull of his shirt clinging to his wounds, and he flinches when it's torn away for first aid. What happened, indeed? Naomasa thought he was being careful, making sure to check that everyone still believed in his cover story. He played the part of a quirkless man, fed up with how the world treated him. A man ready to get revenge. It was going well, until I messed up, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. They had a mind reader on their side. The boss's right-hand man, woman I suppose. He looked down at the 2 gashes running down his torso and paled. He was attacked the instant they knew. Another man was with me, skimming money from their profits. I only got away because he... Naomasa's words faded as he shuddered at the memory. They'd killed the other one first, since his quirk was an offensive type, so Naomasa had just enough time to run. Resting his head on the surface of the table, his eyes drooped with exhaustion. How long had he been running? Far longer than his wounds should have let him. The detective made sure to cover his trail, circling all around town before showing up at Toshinori's front door. Then there was Toshinori. Through the entire ordeal, Naomasa was hoping he could make it back to his friend. They had so many talks about what would happen if one of them died in the line of duty. It was a very real possibility, but to disappear without so much of a trace. I just wanted to see you. Toshinori froze, sucking in a sharp breath. Shit. His fingers went rigid and stiff, clawing into the gauze he was pressing at the wounds. Shit. His breath caught in his throat, and his chest jumped for a few airless seconds. He let out a slow breath, turning and ducking his head until it's pressed against 𝗵𝗲𝗧's stomach. His arms loop loosely around 𝗵𝗲𝗧's waist, steadying him and pulling him closer. He can feel blood clotting against his hair. He's aware that he's losing time, that 𝗵𝗲𝗧 was wandering and bleeding for who knows how long, and that this really wasn't helping, but it's not like he wasn't aware of this scene playing out. He'd seen the scars that littered his friend's body, the nicks and scrapes from jobs that left their mark. He'd lost other colleagues before, many of whom he considered friends. He'd been on death's door a few times himself. If Toshinori was totally honest, he practically lived on that doorstep these days. So no, he wasn't a stranger to the dangers of the job. Still, there's a big difference between distantly acknowledging those dangers and having them drip blood on your kitchen floor. Sure, he and 𝗵𝗲𝗧 had talked about the possibility that this might happen, but more often about the possibility that this would happen to Toshinori. As a detective, 𝗵𝗲𝗧 was usually behind the line of fire. Toshinori realized that at some point he stopped being grateful for that and started expecting it. His face twisted in irritation and regret, and he takes a steadying breath. He'll have time for self-loathing later. Enough time was wasted as it is. Toshinori digs his fingers into the side that isn't wounded, takes a deep breath, and slides back. He dabbed at the blood that pooled while he hesitated, wincing in sympathy when 𝗵𝗲𝗧 makes a pained noise. Then he sat the bloodied gauze on the floor, gathering the bandages in his hand in the same gesture. 𝗵𝗲𝗧's information danced through his head. 1. They had a second in command who read minds. 2. They know about the police spy presence. Not to mention there was a dead criminal to log as well. Not the most pleasant of bedside topics, but it'll work as a distraction. Can you remember anything else? Any other information? Toshinori asks, then starts to wrap the bandages tightly around 𝗵𝗲𝗧's sides. 𝗵𝗲𝗧 felt his body shift as he was pulled against his friend's head and chest, and honestly, the warmth more comforting than he cared to admit. His eyes closed, appreciative of the safety he felt inside the circle of Toshinori's lanky arms, a feeling that had been in short supply these last few weeks. It was much colder when Toshinori went back to wrapping the open wounds, fingers ghosting over his skin in cheap replacement. Please, don't let go, he thought. Any other information? Toshinori's voice had an edge of desperation in it, and 𝗵𝗲𝗧's eyes fluttered back open at the question. He filtered back through his memories, gripping the tabletop in effort to hold on to consciousness. Most plans would have changed after being ousted as a traitor. None of the 𝐒𝐻 were ever set in one location, easily abandoning buildings and people once they had no use for them. He witnessed firsthand when they sunk an entire pier of boats because the wrong person was snooping around for too long. Drugs. His breathing had calmed somewhat, but he groaned in pain as he turned to speak. They're trading drugs for information. The homeless, disgruntled workers. Anyone who wants to forget their life. Taking a bloodied hand to his trouser leg, he lifted the hem so Toshinori could see something tucked into his sock. 𝗵𝗲𝗧 cursed as his fingers fumbled with the package, weakly handing it over. Some kind of mix between euphorics and aphrodisiacs. Makes a person really happy when they take it, and 𝗵𝗲𝗧 panicked, shamefully gripping Toshinori's wrist. Everyone had to take it at least once. He had so many of the tiny pills because they wanted all the underlings to be addicted. The higher up you were on the chain, the more diluted the product. They couldn't have their best lackeys strung out, but every single person was loyal because they wanted more. I'm so sorry for coming here and letting you see me like this. I couldn't go to the hospital and 𝗵𝗲𝗧's eyes were dark and pleading. He hesitated with the words on his lips, having already said them once. If he was going to die, then he had wanted to see Toshinori one last time. A swirl of emotion caused the exhaustion to finally hit him, and 𝗵𝗲𝗧 found himself sliding to the floor. Please don't leave. As unconsciousness claimed the detective, he didn't know if the words were spoken aloud or if they remained only in his thoughts. Toshinori shifted with 𝗵𝗲𝗧 when he slumped, gently guiding the detective to tiled floor. He rolled 𝗵𝗲𝗧 onto his unwounded side, bracing him against the wall. Toshinori's woken up coughing on his own blood enough times to not wish the experience on anyone else. Then he trailed his fingers briefly against 𝗵𝗲𝗧's cheek, smudging away some of the blood smeared there. Toshinori stood, swaying slightly. He was pretty certain he became unqualified to provide any helpful aid when drugs came into the picture. He could deal with blood loss, but this was over his head. So, time to call for help, then. Please don't leave. The request was so simple, quiet. Toshinori was halfway out the kitchen door before he freezes, hesitating. He tightened his hold around the doorframe. He chokes, then clears his throat. I'll be right back, I promise. So don't. Toshinori swallows and forces a weak laugh. Don't go anywhere, okay? Please, please, don't die, he thinks. Toshinori wastes precious time in the bedroom fumbling about trying to find his phone. He finds it wedged between the mattress and the headboard. His fingers shake so badly that he almost hits the wrong button. The phone only rings once before it clicks to call, but it feels like an eternity. "Hello, 𝗵𝗃𝗲," says a professional voice, but Toshinori cuts it off. "Chiyo," he yells, talking over her. "You need to come to my place right now. It's an emergency. Already on the way." Chiyo is the one to cut him off this time. Toshinori can hear the distinct click of her cane through the phone. "What did you do now?" Her dry, exasperated tone calmed Toshinori slightly. He stood, turning to make his way back to the kitchen, as he recounted what happened. "Tsukachi said he couldn't go to the hospital," he finishes, lingering just outside the doorway. "I don't know if that's because he's being tailed, or if he thought a regular hospital couldn't handle." Toshinori faltered for a second, his free hand squeezing the packet Naomasa had given him. Everyone had to take it at least once, he'd heard. That probably means that Naomasa, that he'd, Yagi-san, prompted 𝗵𝗃𝗲, and Toshinori forced his breathing back to normal. He hadn't even realized it sped up. "Whatever reasons he has, Tsukachi will need private assistance," Toshinori says. His voice sounded flat and dull even to his own ears, and there's a moment of silence on the other end of the line. After a moment, Toshinori hears a soft rustling, probably 𝗵𝗃𝗲 nodding. He hears a door shut, an engine start. 5 minutes away, says 𝗵𝗃𝗲, then hangs up. Toshinori stared blankly at the call-ended screen blinking on his phone, then exhales slowly. He entered the kitchen in a daze and settled himself numbly on the floor next to Naomasa. "Okay," he says, though it comes out shaky and uneven. 5 minutes. How much blood had Naomasa already lost? How many pills had he not been able to sneak away from taking? How long had he been wandering around before he's made it here? Bile and blood start rising in Toshinori's throat, an effect of old wounds he's long gotten used to. He swallowed the bitter mixture down, curling an arm around Naomasa's shoulder. He tucked the other's head against his shoulder, resting his chin on the top of Naomasa's head. Like this, he can feel the soft exhales of his friend's breath, faint as they may be. He let that sensation lull him into a less frantic state as he waited for help to arrive. Naomasa's eyes were forced open, a bright light yanking him from sleep. He tried to move away from the annoyance but found that his body refused to respond. Shaking away the fog, he could feel his head resting on something soft. It was a gentle presence that seemed to hold him upright, burying his face into the clean scent. He sighs as it affords him reprieve from the light. "Hold him still," a woman's voice. Naomasa flinched, hands curling around the shirt of whomever he was laying on. 2 hands push his head forward until he can see the owner of the voice. A wave of relief washed over him. 𝗵𝗃𝗲. Then the one holding him had to be Toshinori. "What have you gotten yourself into, detective?" Her face was stern but the words were laced with worry. Naomasa tried to smile as she pressed a kiss to his cheek. All at once the pain lessened in his stomach, lowering to tolerable ache. Chiyo stood as imposingly as possible at her height and addressed him sternly. "Your wound isn't gone, dear. I had to focus on your body processing the drugs." Fatigue set in even stronger, Naomasa nodding both at her words and in fighting off sleep. Chiyo then turned to Toshinori, eyes sharp and serious. "Watch him for any signs of withdrawal. If he gets worse, call me again. And think about asking Nedzu for help. He'll have ways to keep our detective safe." Toshinori nodded along to Chiyo's directions as she runs him through a list of symptoms to watch for. Mercifully, she keeps it fairly clean. Watch for tremors or seizures, vomiting blood, dizziness, low body temperature, and memory lapses. Keep an eye on Naomasa's temperature, and make sure he gets liquids at some point to replace what he's lost. She doesn't go too deeply into what any of the symptoms are signs of, probably to keep Toshinori from panicking, an allowance that he's very grateful for. The whole time she kept her voice brisk and professional, but Toshinori doesn't miss the concerned way her eyes linger on him. He gives her a weak, watered-down version of his regular grin, and she inclines her head slightly in acknowledgement of that. When Chiyo is finally satisfied with the care she's provided, she collects the supplies she's brought. Some things get stored away in her med bag, and some she moves to an area of the table that she'd sterilized earlier. She makes sure that Toshinori sees what she puts down, and where. She makes eye contact with him, and he nods to let her know he understands how and when to use what she's left. Toshinori doesn't move to stand when Chiyo leaves, though she doesn't seem offended. She gives Toshinori one last look before she slips out of the kitchen. Toshinori gets a glimpse of concern and something akin to sympathy before she disappears. Honestly, he's too drained to worry about what that means. He's crashing hard from the combination of the ungodly hour he'd been awoken and everything that's happened since. It's enough to make him wish he could still handle coffee, despite how he's always hated the taste. He knows he won't be sleeping even without the aid of caffeine, though. He can't even imagine resting till he's absolutely sure Naomasa isn't in any more danger. Thinking about that brings Toshinori back to himself a bit. He can feel his legs and feet tingling a bit, going numb from sitting on the floor. His arm was growing numb as well, circulation limited by Naomasa's head where it rests against his shoulder. The hand that isn't pinned near 𝗵𝗲𝗧𝗵𝗲 hip rests against his neck. Toshinori had moved it there sometime during Chiyo's lecture, fingers seeking reassurance in the man's pulse. 𝗵𝗲𝗧's fingers twist in the fabric of Toshinori's bed shirt, his forehead resting in the dip of Toshinori's shoulder, their chests angled to press against each other. If he hadn't been crashing so hard from the events of the last hour, Toshinori would probably have been embarrassed by the intimacy of the position. As it is, though, he finds himself shifting his grip on 𝗵𝗲𝗧's hip, pulling them flush against each other. His thumb traces a reassuring pattern on 𝗵𝗲𝗧's neck, and Toshinori sighs, letting a bit of tension drain out of him. Doing all right, he mumbles out loud, although he doesn't really expect a response. The chilly kitchen air hitting his back was what woke him up. 𝗵𝗲𝗧's front was covered in warmth, so he shivered, nuzzling closer to the source of heat. When he did, the dull ache came back, and with it his sense of reality. He found himself in a loving embrace, entangled and still on the floor. Toshinori's heartbeat thudded in his ears, the slow rhythm of it saying the man was still deep asleep. 𝗵𝗲𝗧 was more lucid than he had been in 2 weeks, the closeness between them now setting his face aflame. Why had he come here, risking the 𝐒𝐲𝐽 finding Toshinori? It was the only thing that kept him going. And really, the former hero was the only person he could think of to trust. Uncurling himself from his sleeping friend's body, 𝗵𝗲𝗧 willed his muscles to get working. Immediately he had the urge to throw up. If the drugs in his system were good for anything at all, it was that they took the edge off the pain. His hands gripped the kitchen table to steady himself, and he took note of the dried blood staining the wood. The sunlight of early morning streamed through the window, illuminating the room. 𝗵𝗲𝗧 grimaced. His clothes were in tatters and impossibly red. He didn't really care for the style anyway. Tight jeans and muscle shirts were for a different, younger sort of man than him. But looking like an extra from a horror movie was less than ideal. His bandages had already bled through and he couldn't find the shirt he'd been wearing. It must have gotten stripped away during the first aid. A quick peek at his friend showed off the trouble he caused the night before. Blood was everywhere, not only on the floors but in Toshinori's hair and clothes. 𝗵𝗲𝗧 was thankful. The only reason he was alive was because of Toshinori. With a sigh, he uses the small sink to wash away the clinging grime from his hands. Alone he loses hope for the water to ever run clear. Toshinori woke up with a start once 𝗵𝗲𝗧 started moving. He was still dazed from being woken so quickly, still half asleep, honestly, and it takes him a second to remember why he's on the kitchen floor instead of his bed. The soft thump 𝗵𝗲𝗧 makes when he stumbles against the table brings everything back. And Toshinori takes a second to watch his friend before he gets up. He remained quiet as he watched 𝗵𝗲𝗧 stagger to the sink. Though he's more than a little tempted to stand and steady his friend, especially when he staggers and has to lean against the kitchen table. The only reason he doesn't is because he wants to take a second to observe his friend for the symptoms Chiyo warned of. He knew 𝗵𝗲𝗧 was the type to try and make light of his suffering for the sake of others. It was a rather frustrating habit that the both of them shared. Unless something was very, very wrong, Toshinori was going to have to gauge 𝗵𝗲𝗧's true pain levels himself. From what he could tell using his eyes alone, 𝗵𝗲𝗧 looked better than he did last night. The bandages were already soaked in blood, which was concerning, but Toshinori himself was pretty dry, even where 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝗏 had been pressed against him while he slept. The blood on the bandages also looked tacky and was flaking a bit, not very fresh then, which was reassuring. And while 𝗵𝗲𝗧 may be swaying slightly while he stands at the sink, the fact that he can support himself at all is an improvement on last night. There's a frustrated noise from the sink. Toshinori runs his eyes over his friend one more time, just making sure he's actually there, and then pushes himself to his feet, wincing as his muscles cramp. "I think you might have better luck if you use the shower, you know," he says, moving to stand a bit behind the detective. The sudden presence behind 𝗵𝗲𝗧 makes him jump. He turns quickly, grabbing at the closest thing to him in self-defense. The moment he recognizes the fluffy blonde hair on his friend's head, 𝗵𝗲𝗧 allows himself to relax. Then the pain sets in as his body punishes him for such wide movements. The weapon, a mere teaspoon, sits harmlessly against Toshinori's chest. "How are you so quiet?" 𝗵𝗲𝗧 laughs dully, tossing the utensil back on the counter with a clang. He shakes his head, but Toshinori's suggestion to use the shower is a welcome one. "I think I remember where the towels are." 𝗵𝗲𝗧 quickly left the kitchen with a word of thanks, smiling so he didn't double over in front of his friend. The tiny closet outside of the bathroom was filled with soft white towels, the pristine white making him frown at the thought of ruining Toshinori's things. Grasping one, the rest came cascading down as if to show off how badly he was messing up his friend's simple life. He cursed, resolving to pick the mess up later when he was clean. But to be honest, 𝗵𝗲𝗧 wasn't sure if he would be able to stand back up without assistance if he tried. Toshinori realized his mistake when 𝗵𝗲𝗧 starts. The teaspoon/weapon startles him a bit when it makes contact with his chest. But any surprise he feels at that is overridden by the sharp drop in his stomach at the detective's expression as he turns. He looks afraid and wild, like he's in a life or death situation, not safe in his friend's home. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 relaxes and laughs, but it sounds wooden and forced. He says something about remembering where the towels are and slips out of the kitchen, but Toshinori hadn't missed his wince of pain when he'd turn, or the way he still looks unsteady. Toshinori leans against the sink for a second, exhaling slowly and gripping the slippery counter tightly. Admittedly, sneaking up, even accidentally, on someone who's been living undercover for more than a week may not have been the best idea he's ever had, and the momentary regret from that is a hard pill to swallow. But even harder is the deeper well of guilt that he feels for letting any of this happen in the first place. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 wasn't a fighter. It wasn't that Toshinori, though he couldn't take care of himself. He's seen 𝗬𝗄𝐴 through enough fights to know he's not anywhere near helpless. But it was stupid to think that he could go up against an entire drug cartel with, what? The ability to detect lies. The admittedly very basic knowledge they'd had of the 𝐒𝐻 before he'd infiltrated. Letting him go on the mission alone. Setting up such a mission in the first place. It was stupid and risky, and Toshinori was going to have strong words for the police administration once this is over. But his irritation at the police force was more than overshadowed by his frustration and anger at himself. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 might not have listened to anyone on the force who urged him not to go, but he would definitely have listened to All Might, #1 hero. Or, failing even that, he'd have listened to Toshinori, his oldest friend. But no, Toshinori had blindly, stupidly let his friend go, with no better armor than vague wishes of good luck. It's enough to make him sick. Toshinori forced himself to let go of the counter. Stewing in this wasn't going to help anyone in the long run, and his energy would be better spent doing something to actually help his friend. He drifted on autopilot out into the hall. There were a few towels in a sloppy pile on the floor. Toshinori eyes them critically, then grabs two that look the worst stained. He'll probably have to throw at least a few out when this is over, so he'll start with the ones that are already beyond saving. Toshinori pads further down the hall, then raps lightly on the bathroom door. "Can I come in?" he asks, determined not to needlessly startle his friend again. The water was running full blast on hot. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 waiting for the heat to kick in before stepping inside. Undressing proves a slow and arduous task. Gravity wasn't enough to dislodge the slim jeans from his hips, the dried blood shrinking them even further. By the time he slips them off, there's a knock on the bathroom door. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 briefly wonders if it's better to jump in the shower before answering. He doesn't want Toshinori to worry any more about his lack of mobility. But then again, jumping didn't sound too pleasant at the moment. With a sigh, he let the man in, just waiting for it to get warm. It wasn't a lie. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 disliked lying, but even the half-truth felt like chalk in his mouth. Usually his omitting of facts was for criminals, not his best friend. Looking up at Toshinori's concerned expression, he gives him an embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry about before, but you don't need to worry about me. You've done more than enough by keeping me alive." It was far more than 𝗬𝗄𝐴 had expected when he came. And of course he repaid the kindness by trying to stab the man with a spoon. "Really? Thank you." His smile grows into one more genuinely loving, head tilting to the side and hoping Toshinori knew just how grateful he was. Now, for the shower. His acting skills would be put to the test as he made his way under the rushing water without showing any hint of pain. Toshinori frowned slightly. 𝗬𝗄𝐴 was always a terrible liar, and coming down off whatever he'd been dosed with hadn't improved his skill at all. Toshinori focuses on that over what 𝗬𝗄𝐴 is saying, running his eyes over his friend's body, scanning for any obvious wounds that he might have overlooked. "I'm sorry about before, but you don't need to worry about me. You've done more than enough by keeping me alive." Toshinori snapped his eyes back to 𝗬𝗄𝐴's face. A small part of him was embarrassed that he might have been caught staring, the same part that had, admittedly, been more than a little interested in the tighter-than-normal clothes his friend had been wearing. But Toshinori is more concerned with correcting 𝗬𝗄𝐴, assuring him that he'd never be a burden, and that Toshinori is always going to be there. And he was happy to do so. That 𝗬𝗄𝐴 would always be welcome to come to Toshinori when he was in trouble, no matter what that trouble might be. That he wouldn't ever have to feel bad for coming to him for help. Toshinori opened his mouth to try and express all that, but 𝗬𝗄𝐴 beats him to the punch. "Really? Thank you." He grinned softly up at Toshinori. Expression is soft to the point of being tender. It's enough to make Toshinori's heart skip a beat. 𝗬𝗄𝐴's head was cocked slightly to one side, and Toshinori had an unbidden thought that he could easily tilt his chin up and pull him into a kiss. While Toshinori was trying to digest that, 𝗬𝗄𝐴 strips off the last of his clothes and steps up to the shower. He sways slightly, and Toshinori shakes himself off mentally and steps up behind him to offer support. Whatever was causing thoughts of things like kissing his best friend will have to wait to be examined. Right now, Toshinori's main job is to offer support. The light touch against his back kept 𝗬𝗄𝐴 from slipping on wet porcelain. He never minded the overt ties to America, but right now not being able to sit and wash was troublesome. "Is it that obvious I need help?" He laughed at himself, turning his head to look back at Toshinori. His friend's eyes were determined to keep him from further injury. "Would you mind if I sat on the edge? I know it isn't proper use of a tub like this, but—" Naomasa didn't need to worry the man by falling to his death in the bath. With a low groan, his body lowered until his legs could curl under the water and he could lean into the tub with ease. Toshinori made no movement to leave. Was he going to watch him the entire time in case he drowned? "I'm not going to die on you yet." There was a touch of amusement in Naomasa's voice at the whole situation. He knew his friend was prone to worrying, but this was an entirely new level. "If you're going to stay, then can you get my back? I can't really reach right now. I'm not going to die on you yet." Naomasa probably didn't intend for that to hit as hard as it does. Despite the fact that it was a joke, something to lighten the mood, Toshinori finds himself blinking rapidly, trying not to tear up. It's stupid, but Naomasa hadn't seen himself last night, hadn't seen the worst of the blood, or heard the frantic tone of his own voice. Everyone had to take it at least once. "Please, don't leave." Toshinori swallowed, ducking his head. Naomasa's back was to him, thankfully, so he wouldn't see whatever face Toshinori was making right now. Toshinori settled himself behind his friend on the tile, then dunked one of the washcloths he had grabbed into the already reddening water. He wrung it out over Naomasa's back, then sets it again and begins to wash the grime off on slow, gentle strokes. He stayed quiet, thinking, until his friend's broad shoulders have been washed clean. Then Toshinori sighs and sets the washcloth down, replacing it with his bare hand. "𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲 𝐔𝐸," he says, absently brushing the knob of one at the top of Naomasa's spine with his thumb. "You know that you are important to me, right?" Even though he wasn't directly under it, the heat from the water soothes Naomasa's aching joints. It takes a number of vigorous scrubs before he begins to see his normal color, and by then the tub is starting to stain red. The fact he was still breathing suddenly seems a miracle. The red tinge never fully drains away. Toshinori is much more gentle with his work. Naomasa's eyes close with a soft sigh, the warm circles lulling him into relaxation. He welcomes his friend's insisted presence now. He could have fallen asleep right then and there. When Toshinori finishes, he almost lets out a sound of complaint when the cloth is taken away. His eyes open in confusion when a large hand is pressed into his back. "You know that you are important to me, right?" Toshinori's voice was laced with an emotion he couldn't place. The strange wavering coupled with the intimate brushing of his friend's fingers sends shivers down Naomasa's spine. He could feel the heat rise up his neck, to his face and chest. His whole body felt a rush of warmth. What would he be feeling right now if it was Toshinori that had shown up on his door, bleeding out in the dead of night? He turned around the best he could, grabbing onto Toshinori's arm. I know, was what he wanted to say, but looking up at Toshinori's face, seeing his expression, did he really? I didn't know. His eyes want to tell him how sorry he was for all this, how thankful he was. "But you're important to me too." Toshinori took a second to appreciate the flush across Naomasa's chest and the arches of his cheeks. He lets himself enjoy this, not just the physical contact between them, but the warm openness of the moment. He lets that sink in, trying to memorize how it feels. If what he says next ruins whatever is between them, he wants to be able to remember at least this much. "When I said important, I didn't mean." Toshinori stops, words catching in his throat. He's aware that his mouth is still open, and he feels a bit foolish, but it's overridden by his desire to get this out. "When," he says at length, voice careful, "when you started this mission, I was, well, really worried." "I don't," Toshinori snorts dryly, shaking his head. "Never in 100 years would I think of you as weak, you know. But at the same time, you're not really built for combat, so." He lifts the hand that had been resting on Naomasa's back and covers the fingers still wrapped around his arm. He makes sure to keep his touch light enough that Naomasa could pull away if he wanted to. "I was worried even before you, came back, I guess. I was worried when you didn't contact anyone, but it was bearable. Because, no news is good news, right?" Toshinori sighed heavily and drags his free hand down face, covering his expression. "Not that I really believed that, but it was something. And then you know." And Toshinori took a breath in an attempt to steady his shaking voice. "The blood and stuff, it wasn't good, definitely. But I'm kind of used to that kind of thing by now. Happens a lot in our line of work, I guess. But you were, because of the drugs, probably you were scared. Bad. And Toshinori instinctively tightens his hand around Naomasa's, then realizes his mistake and forces it to relax. He wants to curl over, rest his head against the detective's shoulder, to be as close as they'd been the night before. But he remembers Naomasa's face when he'd surprised him in the kitchen earlier, and refrains. "I really don't want to make this something about me. You definitely got the shorter end of the stick here, so I shouldn't be complaining." But Toshinori sighs and shudders, face twisting into a frown. "I definitely don't ever want to see you like that again. Not that I thought it was weak, of course, just feeling like you can't help someone you care about. It's not a good feeling. And I definitely do care about you, so." Toshinori coughs, suddenly awkward. I wanted to make sure you knew that, in case one of us, didn't get as lucky as we have so far. He pauses, mentally running over his speech. It wasn't quite what he's wanted it to be. Not as direct, definitely, but that might be for the best. At least what he did say leaves room for Naomasa to willfully misunderstand what Toshinori meant by caring about his friend, which is just as relieving as it is nerve-wracking. All right, Toshinori swallows awkwardly. Okay, good talk. Naomasa's mouth opens and closes about 1,000 times, wanting to interject but not being able to. Watching Toshinori ramble through his thoughts and feelings, there was no way Naomasa could say a word. He knows, really knows, that Toshinori doesn't think of him as weak. There had been nothing but the highest respect between them. That's why he was so drawn to All Might to begin with. Ignoring how amazingly strong the man was, he never looked down on anyone. And Naomasa, more than anyone, knew his limitations. The light touch around his hand tightened when Toshinori recounted last night. The drugs, the fear he saw in the detective's eyes. He was shaken deeply by the whole thing. And Naomasa hates that he's done that to his best friend. I definitely don't ever want to see you like that again. I definitely do care about you. In case one of us. By the time Toshinori finishes, with his uncomfortable cough marking the end of his speech, the shower had long grown cold. Naomasa shivers, reaching for the towel to cover himself before shutting off the faucet. Once the sound of rushing water disappears, the quiet is deafening. The same. Naomasa's words are low, hardly above a whisper. Not the strength. All Might could never be broken. But when you came out of the hospital the first time, I didn't want my best friend to die. He did understand, after all. So, I promise, Toshinori, I really won't die anytime soon. For a while they sit in silence, not knowing what to say to the other. Naomasa sneezes. Then he laughs. I think it's time I get out. His hand left Toshinori's arm so he could wrap the towel around his waist. I didn't think about what I would change into. Toshinori shifted awkwardly while they sat in silence. It's not like he expected. Well, for the most part, it's not like anything he'd said had been anything he wouldn't say to any of his friends. Were they in a similar situation? Still, it was a bit disappointing that he hadn't managed to get what he was thinking across fully. Naomasa's loud sneeze makes Toshinori start. He feels a bit guilty for getting wrapped up in his own thoughts and delaying his friend, especially considering how they're supposed to be keeping an eye on his temperature. I didn't think about what I would change into. Toshinori glances over at his friend, then quickly looks away. The sight of him still slightly damp and wearing nothing but a towel around his waist, it's a bit much, honestly. If you want to wait here, I'll grab some spares from my room, suggests Toshinori. He waited for Naomasa to nod his assent, relaxing significantly once he does. The thought of Naomasa in his bedroom while still in his current unclothed state is definitely a thought Toshinori will devote time to, but later. Toshinori quickly made his way to the bedroom. He rustled through his drawers for a change of clothes, grabbing the smallest shirt and pair of pants he owns, though they'll probably still be far too large for his friend. Toshinori isn't sure whether he's grateful for that or not. Regardless, the image of Naomasa in one of his shirts, long enough to be a dress on the smaller man, goes into Toshinori's mental consider later folder. Toshinori almost leaves the room before he realizes that Naomasa is going to need boxers as well, since the ones he had were probably ruined by the blood. He ends up staring at the wall for a good 30 seconds, pondering which option is more mortifying. His choices don't look too good. He can conveniently forget that people usually wear, well, underwear, or be awkwardly aware of the fact that the guy who, in the last hour alone, he's seen naked, thought about kissing, and helped wash, is now wearing his boxers. In the end, Toshinori resigns himself to his fate, and grabs a pair of boxers that are good enough to wear, but worn enough that he won't feel bad for shoving them in the laundry bin and never wearing them again. He heads back to the bathroom, knocking once on the door to let Naomasa know he's coming back in. Once alone in the bathroom, Naomasa has time to finally study himself in the mirror. The reflection isn't too pretty, dark circles under his eyes making him look far more hollow than he was used to. It's no wonder Toshinori couldn't leave him alone. He looked like death would take him at any moment, rather than dwell on his looks. He dried off, thoughts wandering to his friend. Toshinori's care thus far was comforting, but it concerned Naomasa how much every gesture, every touch of affection sent his emotions in a daze. Toshinori obviously considered all he had done to be in the name of close friendship. It was only Naomasa that was reading everything too far. Was Chiyo wrong about clearing his system completely? What if this was some sort of side effect? If it was, he needed to say something. The idea was so appalling it gets dismissed even as he thinks it, as if that was a conversation Naomasa wanted to have, telling his best friend he might be having withdrawals because it felt good to hold hands. He dragged his hands over his face with embarrassment, groaning inwardly. With impeccable timing, there was a knock at the door. Toshinori was back with a set of clothes. Thanks, Naomasa says, taking the folded outfit with a smile. He pushes his problem aside for now, thinking it better to focus on getting dressed first. He's grateful for the simple white shirt, worn in and soft. The size was most likely the smallest Toshinori could find. Even then, Naomasa notes with a laugh, it sits at mid-thigh when he slips it on. The pants fare a tiny bit better. They drop lower than he would like, but the long shirt fixes that problem. The only thing he has to do is roll up the cuffs. Naomasa looks up appreciatively, holding his arms out as if to say, "How do I look?" before a frown takes over his face, taking a step toward Toshinori. His hand reaches towards the mess of blonde hair. Toshinori was still caked with blood. "I didn't realize. Sorry about that." Toshinori froze up the second Naomasa looked over at him. Ridiculous as it was, he's sure for a second that his friend's frown was because he could tell what Toshinori had been thinking while he was grabbing clothes. His breath catches for a whole different reason when Naomasa steps up into his personal space, winding a hand in his hair. "I didn't realize. Sorry about that." It takes Toshinori a second to realize that this was about the blood still clotted in his hair. He reached up to tug at it, then stills when his fingers brush Naomasa's wrist. He says, then winces, fittingly eloquent for the number one hero. "It's fine. I'll wash it out in the sink. I can shower later, once you're asleep." Once he says that, Toshinori pauses. He took it as a fact that Naomasa would be staying with him until Nedzu or the police department could arrange something better. He's just now realizing that his friend might prefer something else. His mind jumps to the split-second thought he's had earlier. He'd been lucky that everything he's done so far, hugging, sleeping together in the kitchen, bathing, had been read as platonic. The longer Naomasa spent around him, the more he was in his space without their usual buffer of work and personal space, the sooner Naomasa was going to notice. And while Toshinori might not be entirely opposed to that, being rejected, as he surely would be as good a reason as any to start moving on. He couldn't imagine that finding out that his best friend of so many years was harboring not entirely platonic feelings for him would really be in Naomasa's best interests right now. "Are you?" Toshinori cleared his throat, this time his fingers purposely brushing the inside of Naomasa's wrist where his hand was still tangled in his hair. As before, he tries to commit this feeling of closeness to memory, just in case. "I mean, do you want to stay here? I won't be angry if you don't, so you can be honest." Naomasa twisted the pretty blonde strands of hair for a moment, surprised when Toshinori's own hand moves up to meet his. It felt nice in a way, but he was getting too sentimental again. "Do you want to stay here? I won't be angry if you don't." His eyebrows raised in bewilderment. Naomasa was sure that it was him overstaying his welcome. After all, he'd bled all over Toshinori's kitchen, kept the man up all night, and used all the hot water. His hand fell down to his side, then back up again to scratch behind his neck awkwardly. If it's not a bother, with enough time, there were other places for him to stay. But this is where he wanted to stay, where he felt, was it strange to say he felt safe? "Could I stay?" Naomasa shifted, suddenly feeling small in the cramped bathroom. "Just for a few days, until it's safe to contact the precinct. There's a lot of information to process, and I know you have to work." And he was rambling now, a bad habit that flared up when he felt overwhelmed. Looking at Toshinori apologetically, the words just wouldn't stop. Toshinori shook his head as Naomasa rattled off excuses as to why he shouldn't stay. Toshinori was equal parts relieved and frustrated. The rambling was a habit that the detective only resorted to when stressed, so Toshinori knew that he really did want to stay. But it was a double-edged sword, just as cutting as it is relieving. That Naomasa would believe even for a second that he would kick him out after something like last night. Well, it's not exactly nice to know that he was acting in a way that would lead to his friend thinking that, for the sake of his mental health, Toshinori was going to assume that it's a result of the last of the drugs fading from Naomasa's system and a habit of self-deprecation, rather than a genuine fear of Toshinori abandoning him. Regardless of where the thoughts come from, Toshinori didn't plan to let them bother his friend for long. "Hey," he says, interrupting Naomasa's stream of thoughts. "You know you're always welcome here." He can't tell if that's enough to reassure Naomasa. Normally, Toshinori'd just cut his losses and hope he could show his support less directly. But, well, today seems to be a charge forward blindly and hope for the best kind of day, so I mean that, he says, and then reaches out to mimic the grip Naomasa had had on him just a moment ago. His palm cups Naomasa's cheek, his fingers brushing the short strands of hair on the sides of the detective's head. Toshinori offers a grin, smaller than his usual, but genuine. "I've already said that you're important to me, but I'll repeat it as many times as I need. I'm happy to." He nods, finding a train of thought to follow. "You aren't ever a burden, you know. You've done so much for me, and you never asked for anything in return. And that, well, that's part of why I want to help you now." Toshinori laughs. ducking his head. I mean, the other part is that you're my best friend, so no matter what it is you need, I'll try my best to help you get it. And Toshinori continues, nodding a bit, you'll be safe here, I promise. I may not have one for all anymore, but I'll do everything in my power to help you. Whatever you need, all right. Toshinori finally looks up, meeting his friend's eyes. I promise, whatever it is, I can help, so. He grins, then laughs. It's far quieter than All Might's signature laugh, but he hopes it's just as reassuring. Of course you can stay. And please, ask for whatever you need to feel safe. When Toshinori's hand brushed against his cheek, lightly playing with his hair, Naomasa thought his heart might stop. The small grin on his lips was so reassuring, his kind words trying to convince an embarrassed friend that he's welcome. Damn it, Toshinori, how could anyone be so radiant, perfect, and utterly devastating? If the man thought it appropriate to stop talking for just a second, he would surely notice the hitching of his breath. Naomasa swallowed hard to focus on the words being spoken to him. Whatever you need, all right. Toshinori's eyes finally catch his, and Naomasa is floored with the continued support. The reassurance was something he needed, even though he never doubted the world's #1 hero in the slightest. No, it wasn't All Might that Naomasa was putting his hopes in. It was Toshinori Yagi. He pressed a hand over the large one still hovering next to his cheek. Not trusting his voice for a moment, he could only squeeze lightly before letting go. His friend, his hero. Thank you. He wasn't rambling anymore, and his thoughts were calm again. I do feel safe here. It was Naomasa's turn to smile now, feeling more confident that this was a place he could belong, even for a while. Determined to push his weaknesses behind him, he switched into work mode. Toshinori, do you have a map? I want to mark down all the hideout locations I was aware of. Just because they've been deserted doesn't mean someone hasn't seen something. Reluctant as he was to let this go, Toshinori could respect his friend's switch into professionalism. I do, he says, nodding. Do you need one of just this area, or of the country? Toshinori steps back, letting his hand drift down to his side. He's probably willfully imagining the way Naomasa sways after him. Well, that or his friend was dizzy again. Whichever it was, it passes quickly. Toshinori still keeps an eye on Naomasa as he heads back to the kitchen. The table was still covered in medical supplies, and the floor and one of the chairs were stained with blood. Toshinori distantly notes that it'll take a lot of scrubbing to get the stains out. It's an unpleasant thought, and he puts it aside for later, deciding to burn that particular bridge when he gets to it. Toshinori directs Naomasa toward the small room he's been using as a study. There's a cabinet, a desk, a chair, and not much else in the room. Toshinori doesn't hesitate before gesturing for Naomasa to sit. He keeps a watchful eye on his friend while he settles, then crouches in front of the cabinet. He finds 2 maps, one of all of Japan and one of the city they're living in. He places both in front of Naomasa, then leans against the chair. He's aware that it's quite a bit closer than he'd usually stand. But, well, he can at least have the excuse that it's to steady his friend, rather than to selfishly reassure himself. If you want to start marking these up, I can get in contact with any pros you think will be helpful. I'm sure Recovery Girl has let the district know you've returned, and I can start asking around about anyone who can help in any other way. With the 2 maps in front of him, Naomasa hesitates as he grabs the one of Japan. He realizes that Toshinori doesn't know where he's been, and when the mark starts showing a prefecture over, he just hopes that it doesn't worry his friend. His eyes close, thinking about what should be done. Toshinori's warmth was comforting behind him, and by now Naomasa was more than used to it. Without his presence, the air seemed too empty and cold. Going through a list in his mind, there was only one hero with a wide enough connection system that could help at the moment. Could you get in touch with 𝐒𝐭𝐴𝐺? Naomasa pointed out a few areas out for Toshinori to see. Have his agency monitor these places for anyone suspicious. He hummed to himself and wondered who else could be contacted. His office could wait the few more days until he was supposed to have returned. If they started worrying now, it would only make the police an easier target. Notes would be good to jot down as well. Ruffling his hair, Naomasa dove into his work. Phone numbers, names, how everyone was connected. If he had any artistic ability, he would have tried to sketch out the faces of the top group members. Instead, he made lines of descriptions of their looks and quirks. It was a while before he started feeling pain again. Toshinori was probably still off making his phone calls. So with a stretch, Naomasa got up and headed to the kitchen. He frowned at the mess. Once he found painkillers, he would definitely clean it up an apology, scanning for the stash of medication Chiyo left behind. There was a medley of bottles sitting on the table, his hands touching the caps trying to decide which one he needed. He hesitated as his fingers stopped on a familiar packet of pills, and the relief he knew they provided. Toshinori locked his phone after a long and somewhat frustrating conversation through a series of phone calls. His name hadn't gone public along with his true form. It's a small mercy to have his privacy, but in this case, it's also a roadblock. He'd had to convince several different people that he should be allowed to speak to 𝐒𝐭𝐴𝐺 in person, which hadn't been easy. Not that he'd been expecting it to be. Pro heroes got tons of weirdos calling every day, so some kind of filter was necessary. Once the call was over, Toshinori, having relayed all he knew, and promising to get any other information to Orca as soon as possible, Toshinori made a few other calls. A message to Nedzu, asking for a meeting sometime soon, and a message to Aizawa. As an underground hero, he'd know how to erase traces of yourself and lie low, surely helpful information for an ousted spy. Toshinori sighed and tapped his phone against his thigh, deep in thought. He wandered to the study, rapping lightly on the door. There wasn't a response, and at first he assumes it's just because Naomasa is absorbed in his work. He hadn't responded at all when Toshinori said he was leaving the room, and his focus was fairly long-lasting, so it wouldn't be surprising if he was still lost in his own head. But when Toshinori poked his head into the study, his friend wasn't anywhere to be seen. The first wave of panic hits pretty much immediately. The only thing that stops Toshinori from giving into it is his years of training. Without calling out again, Toshinori moves soundlessly into the room. He's hoping beyond hope that his friend just collapsed behind the desk. A strange thing to wish for, but it's better than the alternative. A quick look around reveals that Naomasa is definitely nowhere in the room, but it doesn't look like there's been any struggle. Toshinori notes the position of everything in the room anyway, just in case. The next place he heads is the kitchen. There's a chance Naomasa had just changed places on his own. After all, he's still autonomous, capable of his own movement and thought. It's not like he relied on Toshinori for everything. Toshinori pauses outside the kitchen, resting a hand on the wall before he turns into the doorway. He relaxed slightly at the faint sounds of someone moving inside. It seems like he's been panicking over nothing. Toshinori pads into the doorway, and the panic returns full force the second he sees the pill packet Naomasa was cupping in his palm. Toshinori moves faster than he's thought possible in his skinny form. Naomasa had barely turned to face him before he's been punched back against the table with force. Toshinori grabs Naomasa's wrist, far tighter than he's intended to, knocking the open packet to the floor. He hears a few pills rattle on the tile. Though it doesn't register with him at all, he's entirely focused on Naomasa's face right now, searching his eyes for the dazed look from last night. How many? His voice comes out as a harsh bark, and he feels Naomasa try to flinch away from him. Toshinori winces, then forces his hand to relax its vice grip, pulling back to give Naomasa some breathing room. He lowers his voice to something more private. "𝗧𝗵𝗲, did you take any?" For the first time in his life, Naomasa was afraid of his best friend. When his body hit the table and all the air was pushed out from his lungs, he gets a glimpse of what it was like to fight All Might in his prime. The pressure on his wrist is painful enough that Naomasa whimpers. "How many?" Toshinori towers over the detective's smaller frame. His eyes, his voice, everything about him screamed intimidating. Naomasa can't help but flinch in fear. The moment he does, he can hear Toshinori's sharp breath and the grip on his wrist loosen. "𝗧𝗵𝗲, did you take any?" This time the question is softer, but not any more wanted. It hurt that he was being suspected of such a thing. Smoking, and the occasional drink maybe, but addiction to drugs. "No, I was only thinking we should get them to someone for analysis," he faltered. Had the scuffle ripped open the packet, or did he? He swept his tongue around his mouth, searching for the metallic taste the pills gave after dissolving. "Nothing, I don't think I did." He had the unnerving feeling similar to zoning out on a long commute. Naomasa was at a loss, crouching on the floor to pick up the scattered pills before shoving them into Toshinori's hands. "Keep these." "I can't." He shook his head, afraid to say he didn't know for sure. "It doesn't feel like I did." Toshinori could feel his heart kicking in his chest, leftover adrenaline still flooding his system. What was it Qiyo had said to watch for? Tremors or seizures, vomiting blood, dizziness, low body temperature, and memory lapses. Shit. Toshinori rested a hand on Naomasa's back, intending to guide him to a seat. His friend flinches away from his touch, leaving Toshinori's hand hovering awkwardly in the air. He swallows hard, then lets it drop to his side. "If you..." Toshinori clears his throat, then ducks his head and lowers his voice, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "If you need to sit, then I'll walk you back to the study. You probably shouldn't stay in here too long." He glances up through his lashes, gauging Naomasa's reaction. "I'm going to call Recovery Girl about finding somewhere to keep the pills, and, well, because I think you should have someone check on you." That's all right. He hopes that the mix of fear and self-loathing he's feeling right now doesn't show too much. The last thing he wants to do right now is to make things worse for his friend. Friend. He wonders if Naomasa even thinks of him that way right now. Go back to the study, have someone look at him. He almost doesn't answer when a question is posed to him. His heartbeat was thudding too loudly in his ears, and the detective can't figure out which thing is more unnerving, his memory loss or that he can't stop flinching around Toshinori. "I don't want to sit right now." If he was still for too long, the 2-minute lapse would start to bother him even more than it was. Maybe he could scrub the floor to keep him preoccupied. Looking up, he notices Toshinori is still there, worried that he's done something to damage their relationship. It's not your fault. 𝗧𝗏𝗁 takes a step forward, wanting to say something to tell him he wasn't mad, but his resolve wavers. He also realizes that he never answered the question. Recovery girl is probably a good idea. It's not your fault. It's a statement that's immediately cancelled out by the way Naomasa can't even look Toshinori in the eye. It's not a new feeling. Failing someone he cares about. Toshinori's gotten pretty familiar with it over the years, especially once his health had become an issue. But it's more personal than failing a coworker, true, but there's also the fact that Naomasa had been vulnerable, had been depending on Toshinori for support, that he had trusted him, and Toshinori had trampled all over that trust. When Naomasa says something about calling for Chiyo, Toshinori nods robotically in response. His phone had been dropped in his rush into the kitchen, and he almost turns to go get it before realizing that leaving without a word would probably seem like a slight. When he turns back to say something to Naomasa, though, the other man had already busied himself with something near the sink, running water over a cloth. Toshinori hesitated, wavering between pressing his friend with an apology and giving him space. As backwards as it feels, Toshinori decides that he'll give him the space. It's better than crowding him right after practically attacking him. Toshinori finds his phone on its back on the floor. The screen isn't cracked, which is definitely appreciated. He unlocks it and hits the button to auto-dial Chiyo, then waits for her to pick up. The phone only trills 1/2 ring before it's answered. "How is he?" asks recovery girl. And Toshinori winces. It's not like he expected to exchange pleasantries before they discussed this, but still, he seemed alright earlier. He was able to move around and get cleaned up. He started work on recounting what he knew, but you let him work, demanded Chiyo, the disbelief and exasperation clear in her tone. Toshinori instinctively hunches over, cowering even though she can't see. "Toshinori, you." She refrains from actually calling him an idiot with superhuman grace. She sighs, and Toshinori can clearly picture her pinching her nose in frustration. "I'll be there as soon as I can," she says, voice dry. Try to keep him as calm as possible. If he gets confused or upset, ask him basic questions he can easily answer. His name or address or birthday, something you can easily confirm. "All right," says Toshinori, and she starts to say her goodbyes. "Wait, Chiyo," Toshinori says, louder than he'd intended. After a pause to make sure he hasn't been loud enough to call attention to himself, he speaks in a more hushed tone. "What if I'm not? What if I make things worse? Toshinori chokes himself off, voice dying down. There's silence on the other end of the line. And then Chiyo sighs quietly. "Just hold on for now. Panicking won't make things better for anyone. I'll just be a few more minutes. I'll see you soon." Toshinori nodded, even though he's still uncertain. He bids Chiyo farewell, then leans against the wall for a moment, running his hands over his face. "Fuck," he says, hating how his voice comes out quiet and defeated. Then he sighs softly and straightens, turning back to the kitchen. Running the sink with cold water, Naomasa set his mind on erasing all traces of blood. The task wasn't easy. The mess had been sitting for longer than it should have. He could see where Toshinori haphazardly tried to mop up the worst of it. The dull brown seemed to mock him, reminding Naomasa of all his weaknesses leading up to now. If there was something he had to forget, he thought bitterly, it should have been this. The floor never gets as pristine as it was before he came, but it's acceptable for the moment. He was angry at himself. There was no reason to be afraid of Toshinori, who did exactly what he should have in that situation. It wasn't his fault. Yet Naomasa saw the guilt in his eyes when they looked at one another. He was going to wipe the table next, but there was an obvious trail of dried blood leading out of the kitchen to the front door. He was careful coming here, that he knew, but he didn't bleed on Toshinori's doorstep, did he? God damn it. The curse slips out as he hurries to the door, swinging it open and fearing the worst. He didn't expect to see the tiny elderly woman standing there. And from the way she froze with her hand in the air, she didn't expect to see him either. Recovery girl. His eyes sweep around her, looking for the tiniest traces showing his presence. It wasn't as bad as he feared. Somehow he managed to not bleed out until collapsing. But there were still enough signs, and they needed to be cleaned. Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗁, get inside. He almost protested, stuttering out a but before the woman firmly guided him inside and back to the kitchen where she made him sit down. "Tell me what happened. Is there anything you noticed?" Her voice was calm like always, gentle yet demanding. She checked his vitals as he spoke. Naomasa made a note to scrub outside when this was finished. There was no use fighting Chiyo. I was thinking about what to do with the evidence, then my memory goes fuzzy. The next thing I remember was Toshinori. His voice goes quiet, holding me down. There's a moment of silence between them, Naomasa frowning at himself again. I don't blame him for it, but he might. Chiyo pats the detective's face affectionately. "Luckily, you seem in much better condition than last night. You've been well taken care of." She looks pleased, though he's not quite sure why. "I'm okay, But my quirk heals injuries, dear. Poisons and the like can be removed unless it's a current effect of a quirk. But it takes a lot of energy. And you overworked yourself. Just have Toshinori watch over you closely for now. They would be working under the assumption that the memory loss was due to mental stress. Naomasa was surprised it could be that simple. I also wanted to ask about another possible side effect. He looked down nervously, the words forming in his head too embarrassing to say out loud. Could a drug cause attraction? Recovery girl arched a brow. The question wasn't entirely out of place, but I won't know for sure until I examine the drugs, she says, voice careful. But it seems doubtful. The symptoms you described didn't seem similar to anything that might cause infatuation. Drugs that truly alter feelings long-term are still incredibly rare. And I doubt you would be as lucid as you are now if you were under their influence. She nods thoughtfully, then pats his shoulder reassuringly. Of course I'll check thoroughly for anything actually amiss. But as far as such things go. As she finishes, Toshinori slinks into the room. Recovery girl resists the urge to laugh. He looks incredibly similar to a puppy that's been caught chewing on the furniture. He gives her a morose nod, then gives Naomasa a lingering glance, just as he's looking away. Naomasa follows the line of Chiyo's gaze and meets Toshinori's eyes. There's a long, lingering moment where they seem to forget that the rest of the world exists. Then they both glance away, blushing slightly. Oh my god, thinks Chiyo, remembering the earlier question. She has to bite her lip to keep from snorting with laughter. To distract herself, she nodded to Toshinori, then holds out her hand. If you still have the samples, now would be a good time to hand them over. Toshinori hands over the pills, grateful to see them out of his hands. Chiyo tucked the majority of the pills into one of her pockets. She holds a single one in the palm of her hand, pulling out a palm-sized machine and slipping the pill into a slot in the side. The machine starts softly peeping, then it spits out information on the contents of the drug. Toshinori keeps a close eye on Chiyo's face, trying to gauge how bad things may be. He jumps in surprise when Naomasa's hand brushes his. He hadn't noticed the man cross the room. All right, Toshinori murmurs, keeping his voice low enough not to distract Chiyo. His body moves before he's really thought about it, lightly touching the back of the other man's hand. All right, Toshinori's voice is low and soothing, and Naomasa's heart hurts to hear it. Although Recovery Girl already confirmed he was in good health, all right was far from how he felt. I want you to know I'm sorry for all this. You've done more than enough to help me. He looks up at his friend from under his lashes, head still bowed with uncertainty. I know I keep repeating myself, but with all this happening, I don't trust myself anymore. Naomasa sighs. What I'm trying to say is, I trust you, Toshinori, more than anyone else. So don't give up on me, please. Before Toshinori can answer, the analysis machine beeps in completion. Chiyo sighs as she reads the data, spitting out numbers and words that were only decipherable to her. There's mostly good news. Your symptoms won't be long-term, but the ingredients, somebody thought hard about what sort of blend to use when making this. Addiction, euphoria, pain suppressants. I won't get into what you've taken, but I can't believe an entire group is using this. Chiyo was rarely angry, but the implications of just how many people have been taking the drugs was too much. I want you to keep a close eye on young Tsukachi here. The longer his body returns to normal function without these in his system, the milder the effects should become. However, I've already noticed his paranoia, and we wouldn't want the memory loss to go unsupervised. Her eyes flash with amusement for a brief second. Perhaps something good could come of this. I mean it. Stay next to one another. And detective, rest easy about your other concerns. As much as Toshinori wants to respond to what his friend said right away, he knows that what he's going to say would best be said in private. As it is, he contents himself with taking Chiyo's orders as literally as possible. He sticks as close to Naomasa as possible, never more than an arm's length away. He listens and commits to memory everything Chiyo has to say about the drug the Xiai have been supplying their members with. Apparently, the addiction and the euphoria were tied pretty closely together. The drug causes a surge in the chemicals that simulate happiness and relaxation in the brain. It'll cause the brain to overproduce certain chemicals, flooding the system with them, which leads the drug's user feeling a transcendental sense of peace and satisfaction. Unfortunately, when taken regularly, the drug will leave the brain unable to respond to or even produce the chemicals that would cause these feelings naturally. In order to avoid the resultant depression and anxiety, Xiai members will have to keep taking the drug. The aphrodisiac effect was, from what Chiyo could tell with her base amount of research, mostly a side effect. The body craves physical stimulation and release to go along with the emotional overload. At some point in Chiyo's lecture, Toshinori found himself reaching for Naomasa out of a need for reassurance. His fingers just brush Naomasa's side when he suddenly remembers the feel of his friend's wrist twisting in his clenched fist, the fear in his eyes when Toshinori snapped at him. Toshinori instinctively flinches away, praying his action went unnoticed. Once 𝐎𝐩𝐽 has wrapped up her lecture, she shops Toshinori out of the room to do a more in-depth examination of Naomasa. Toshinori retreats to the bathroom. First, the shower and tiles needed to be scrubbed down to avoid bloodstains, and the towels have to be soaked if he wanted to save them. That done, he stops by the bedroom to pull out the spare futon he's had since he graduated 𝐒𝐽. It's sort of lumpy, and the pattern is a bit kitschy, but Toshinori falls off the couch every time he tries to sleep on it, so the futon is really the lesser of the two evils. A light tap on the kitchen door results in 𝐒𝐽 swinging it open. She shuts it behind herself, then nods toward the entryway. She had her bag in hand, so Toshinori assumes she's leaving. I'm taking this information, as well as the samples 𝗧𝗵𝗲 obtained, to some of my colleagues. They're all well trusted, so you don't need to worry about word getting out. 𝐒𝐽 eyes Toshinori thoughtfully, waiting to see if he'll object. He trusts her judgment, though. He gives her a solemn nod, and she smiles and pats his arm approvingly. I'll let Nedzu know you'll be housebound for a few days. Her smile grows more devious as Toshinori stutters, and he frowns sulkily at her. When she nods in farewell, though, Toshinori still bows deeply in thanks. Once he's seen 𝐒𝐽 off, Toshinori pads back to the kitchen. He knocks on the doorframe to let Naomasa know he's entering the room. The other man is standing facing the sink, fingers tightly gripping the counter, shoulders hunched. Toshinori pauses, hesitating, but then he steels himself and leans against the counter next to his friend. 𝗧𝗵𝗲, can we talk? He tilts his head to look at his friend. I promise I'm not angry. You aren't causing any trouble, don't worry. But there's something I'd like to say. Toshinori waits till he's sure he has his friend's attention before he continues. Earlier, he stops, clearing his throat. When I saw you in the kitchen earlier, I reacted badly. And Toshinori tilts his head, making sure Naomasa was listening. It was absolutely not your fault. When I panicked and grabbed you, it's not like I thought you'd stoop to something like popping pills for fun. I know you're not the type, especially with something as dangerous as this, but you were forced to take those before. That's what I was worried about. Toshinori sighs, his eyes flicking away and then back to his friend's face. Even if I think my worries, that is, that your recovery from something you were forced to take would be hard on you, and my concerns about how you acted while you were drugged, even if they weren't unfounded, the way I showed those worries was, well, wrong. I shouldn't have hurt you. I didn't intend to, I promise, but that doesn't change the fact that I did, and that more than just hurting you, I did it when you were vulnerable and most in need of my support, and I'd like to apologize sincerely for that. Toshinori waits for that to be digested before he nods. He holds up a hand to delay his friend from speaking, making an apologetic face. Just one more thing, okay. He waits a second, and when he isn't interrupted, he nods. He's not quite strong enough to look Naoma in the face for this part, so he stares down at the floor, face heating steadily. Earlier, you said that you didn't trust yourself. And Toshinori frowns slightly, face pinching. And that you didn't want me to give up on you. Toshinori takes a breath, gathering his strength. I won't. He tilts his chin up, finding the strength to meet his friend's eyes. His smile comes naturally, not feeling forced at all. It's soft and sweet, something few people other than his best friend have ever seen. I won't give up on you, no matter what. Never. I promise, okay. Toshinori holds up his hand, pinky finger extended in a schoolyard symbol of oath-taking. He lets it drop after a few seconds, face flushing. His voice is quieter when he speaks again. I mean it. I can't promise I won't hurt you or panic, but I won't ever give up on you. And Toshinori swallows, then nods. And I'll do everything I can to deserve the trust you've put in me. Until you can trust yourself again, you can depend on me. Naomasa stayed quiet while his best friend spoke. The longer he goes on, the more misty-eyed Naomasa seemed to get. So when Toshinori quickly drops his pinky promise in shame, it's no question of why he crosses the distance between them just to catch their fingers together like children would. I'll hold you to that. He smiles up at Toshinori, much of the residual fear disappearing just from the man's soft expression. This was the person he was comfortable with, the person that he knew. Is Toshinori? The fleeting thought jolts him. Naomasa never considered himself a possessive man, and Toshinori was clearly not his in any sense of the word. His hand reaches up to where his tie might have gone and attempts to loosen the tight feeling in his chest. He forgets he's in a borrowed shirt, only succeeding in dipping the neck further down. A small blush glows pink on his cheeks, and he chokes out a question to Toshinori and attempts to hide his embarrassment. What now? Should we eat, or maybe just head to bed? Toshinori never thought he'd be glad to be anemic. But if it's good for one thing, it's that it keeps his blush down. Naomasa tugged at his shirt, clearly embarrassed by Toshinori's display of affection, and God, he could feel himself reddening further. His blush is no doubt evident by now, and that knowledge makes it worse. What now? Should we eat, or maybe just head to bed? Thank God for small mercies. Food first, says Toshinori, slipping into the more comfortable role of someone looking out for a sick friend. You'll need all the strength you can for the next few days. If you can't handle a full meal right now, we can start with soups and easier stuff. While he's talking, Toshinori absently clenches his hand into a fist, rubbing his thumb over his pinky. It feels warm where Naomasa had linked it with his own. Toshinori feels a bit ridiculous. It's one thing to realize you're probably falling for your best friend. It's another to act like a grade schooler while you're doing it. He shakes himself out of his momentary lapse and smiles at Naomasa. I'm pretty sure I've got everything we could need in the fridge. Either way, so pick whatever you want. Food. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's stomach grumbles just at the mention of it. They hadn't eaten at all today. And after the second round of healing from 𝐒𝐻𝐢, he felt more hunger than any sort of pain. It was late, though, and there was no reason to start making a fuss about a meal. I'd be happy just to have miso and rice. The thought of such a traditional, simple dinner was comforting. How can I help? He looks expectantly at his friend, rolling up his baggy sleeves so they don't hang so much. I do know how to make rice, at least. Naomasa sets about digging through cabinets to find uncooked rice for the cooker. He chats to Toshinori all the while, determined to mend any remaining awkwardness between them. Will you be working tomorrow? I hope you're teaching that Midoriya boy properly. If he ends up half as reckless as you, I won't know what to think. Hopefully his light teasing is taken as such. It seems far too long since they've joked around together. I'll just need a blanket for the couch tonight. Finding the rice, Naomasa measured out a good portion for the two of them, rinsing the grains in the sink. With a clap, the rice is set, and he beams. Even a confirmed bachelor like him couldn't mess it up. Toshinori grumbles at Naomasa's teasing, but lets it slide off his back. To be honest, he's not sure even he could cure Midoriya's recklessness. The kid was destined to outpace him in more ways than one, it seemed. He turns to frown at his friend at the mention of the couch, though. Why would you be sleeping there? He asks, as he concentrates on chopping the ingredients for the soup. The tofu was chopped and stored earlier, so he didn't need to worry about that. He works on the potatoes and mushrooms while he talks. I already set up the futon for myself. You should sleep on the bed. It'll feel better. Trust me, I'm the expert on sleeping with stomach wounds. He snorts dryly while he checks how the stock is coming along, then glances over at Naomasa. Don't worry about staining the sheets or mattress. I can wash some of my older ones from before I got a handle on my cough. They're already stained, so. It takes a second for Toshinori to realize why his friend has a doubtful expression on, and he turns to him immediately, making frantic gestures. They're clean, I promise. I've washed them a bunch of times, so the blood's all gone. Ah, shit. Toshinori ducks his head in embarrassment. Sorry. That was a stupid plan. I'll let you use the good ones. Should have done that in the first place, and I can buy more after. Naomasa didn't know how long he should let Toshinori rattle on about sheets. For some reason, he was under the impression Naomasa would be bothered by it at all. Toshi, he stood next to the man, placing a hand on his arm to calm him down. I won't put you out of your bed. You do realize that if you sleep anywhere else, you won't fit. I'll be fine on the futon. Naomasa stifles a smile. The image of his friend's feet sticking out from the cover's just too cute. As an average-sized man, I can sleep about anywhere. He always liked the light banter with Toshinori, and getting back into it was almost therapeutic. But 𝐒𝐻𝐢 had very specific instructions to have Toshinori stick close. The futon does it. Naomasa turned away. Are we following orders for you to watch me at all times? Because if we are, does it fit in your bedroom? Toshinori frowns at the protest, though it's more out of worry than actual annoyance. I'm not going to force you into anything, but I really think you'll be better off in the bed, he says. Trust me, your side will thank you in the morning. He hesitates, then shrugs and gives his friend a dry grin. Size isn't an issue either. I made sure to get the biggest size I could. Toshinori's grin turns a bit devious, and he bumps Naomasa gently with his hip. I spent enough time freezing my feet off as a kid. Remember when I used to sleep over at yours? Trust me, I've well prepared for this. Toshinori hesitates as he considers the best answer to the last question. Again, I won't do anything you aren't comfortable with. But for tonight especially, I'd be a lot more comfortable if I could keep an eye on you. A lot more comfortable really doesn't begin to describe it. Earlier, when Toshinori hadn't been able to find Naomasa and then finding him in the kitchen, holding the pills, it had literally felt like his heart had stopped. Thinking about it now, his fingers curl into fists, nails biting into his palms. He forces them to relax, then sighs and turns back to the counter. I know it's selfish of me, but, well, he laughs dryly, focusing maybe a bit too hard on the vegetables. There's a pause while he stares at them. The silence stretches awkwardly between them. And mentally, Toshinori curses. Not that he can say he's surprised by this turn of events. He's constantly been overstepped his boundaries since his friend had arrived. First his stunt earlier today, And now this, making demands his friend couldn't politely turn down, essentially trapping him into doing what Toshinori suggested. He finds frustrated tears gathering in the corner of his eyes, both at his inability to help when it matters the most and at his childishness, overreacting and scaring his already vulnerable friend. And now making him uncomfortable with his selfish demands. Hadn't he said not even 5 minutes ago that his friend could depend on him? The act of tearing up itself feels childish and immature, which only serves to frustrate Toshinori further. There's a rustle as Naomasa shifts, and Toshinori turns to face him, forcing a smile. "Sorry, that was," he swallows, hesitating, then sighs. "We should do what's best for you right now. If you want, I can move the futon to the study, and you can stay there instead." It's not quite an apology, but it's something. Toshinori's smile grows a little more genuine as he looks Naomasa in the eye. "Whatever you want, I promise. I don't mind sharing a room at all. Honestly, it will be nice to have someone be there." Naomasa shook his head, trying to make his intentions more clear. "It was a relief you were there when I woke up the first time. I just don't want to put you out any more than I already have." He laughs, almost feeling bashful. "I almost forgot about our sleepovers. You were ridiculously tall even then. Did you know my mom thought about getting a taller bed just for you? She said you were there enough that it would have been worth it." Moving closer to where Toshinori was, he watches as the soup gets closer to being done. "You've suffered enough with being uncomfortable, so don't worry. I've had more than enough practice sleeping in places a person shouldn't sleep. Anything is grand compared to loss. Well, just don't worry." He tries to reciprocate the earlier hip check by bumping his arm lightly against Toshi. "It's good to be able to taste your cooking again." Today was full of more excitement than was necessary, and Naomasa wanted nothing more than to eat and go to bed. It was the sound of a window breaking in the front room. Not having his gun, Naomasa grabs for a weapon, this time getting his hands on a knife, and runs out of the kitchen. Slamming himself tight against the wall, he strafed around the perimeter with eyes steeled for enemies. There wasn't any movement aside from the wind blowing in the curtain, and there isn't any noise or smoke. Naomasa relaxes a little knowing that the threat was gone for the moment. There is, however, a large clump of metal embedded into one of Toshinori's wooden cabinets, note attached to the outside. It's a very rudimentary form of intimidation, but it's effective nonetheless. "Found you." Toshinori reacted almost instantly to the noise. Unfortunately, his first instinct, after all these years, was to try and puff up into All Might. The time it takes to go through the song and dance of reaching for a power that's no longer there puts him a few seconds behind his friend in their rush to the front of the house. The second he gets there, Toshinori realizes the situation, the broken window and the short metal rod pinning the note to the cabinet. Without thinking, Toshinori wraps an arm around Naomasa, who's frozen in the entryway. He tugs the man back toward the kitchen, then diverts to the windowless study instead. He realizes halfway there that he's shifted into practically carrying Naomasa, not just dragging him, but he really can't bring himself to care. In the study, Toshinori reluctantly put his friend down. He finds it hard to fully let him go, though, and ends up holding on for just a few seconds more. Then he forces himself to actually let go, taking a few steps back and rubbing his hands down his face. "Okay," he says, then grimaces at how not okay the situation is. "All right, I need to go turn the stove off before we burn the apartment down. Nedzu's number is on my phone. I'll leave it with you if you feel all right enough to call." A shaky nod from the detective sets that plan in motion. Toshinori hands over the phone and walks quickly to the kitchen. The soup has burned along the bottom, but it's not unsalvageable. Toshinori pours to larger than normal portions. It doesn't seem like they'll be back for leftovers. On the way back, he heads to the front before doubling back to the study. He gives the room a thorough once-over before leaving, noting the location of everything in it and checking for anything besides the note that's out of place. Naomasa was just hanging up the phone when Toshinori re-enters the study. He gives a tired nod as Toshinori sets the soup on the desk, sighing slightly. Then he stepped forward, holding out the phone to return it. Naomasa makes a surprised noise when Toshinori forgoes taking the phone and grabs for his wrist instead, tugging the smaller man into another hug. Toshinori wraps himself around his friend, letting out a shaky breath. "Sorry, just a second," he mutters, though it's muffled by the way his face is pressed against Naomasa's neck. Toshinori sighs again, pressing Naomasa closer and focusing on the way he moves as he breathes, the way Toshinori can feel his pulse in his neck and chest. He noses against the man's shoulder, and is faintly annoyed to find that the shirt he's wearing still smells mostly like the back of Toshinori's closet. Any other time, he'd have been happy, stressed out, guilty. Well, he'd have been something over the thought of his best friend smelling like him. But right now, it's just not what he's looking for. He sighs and forces himself to relax. It doesn't feel like enough, but selfishly dumping his demand for physical contact on Naomasa was definitely a bad idea right now, on so many levels. He lets his arms drop, so that Naomasa could move back if he wanted to. Did 𝐻𝐬𝐻𝐵 have a plan? He asks. Naomasa was vaguely functioning when Toshinori gave him the phone with 𝗫𝐻𝐬's number already punched in. The threat to now felt like mere seconds, his voice near a warble and begging for the UA principal to keep Toshinori safe. Toshinori comes back just as the call is finished. They share a moment's glance before Naomasa tries to return the phone. His heart skips when he feels a tug on his wrist, Toshinori pressing him firmly against his chest. Everything about it felt right. Sorry, just a second. His friend's voice was noticeably deeper, louder with the vibrations running through Naomasa's body. It was as if they were on the same wavelength. Naomasa desperate for the contact, squeezing back to make sure Toshinori was still there. He lingered even after the other man let his arms go slack. Naomasa took in his scent and warmth, committing it to memory. 𝗫𝐻𝐬's sending a car to pick us up. Doesn't want to risk us leaving on our own. He's arranging a safe house, too. Reluctantly, Naomasa steps back from the embrace. My being undercover was supposed to be a part of a larger operation against the 𝐎𝐩𝐽. In 1 month's time we were supposed to launch a counterattack with a group of heroes and the entire police force, but now that timeline's been expedited. The detective sunk down into the desk chair, burying his face into his hands. The moment he read the note, the blood in his body ran cold. They found him, but it wasn't him that he was concerned about. The 𝐎𝐲 knew about Toshinori now. I got you caught up in this. There were bloodstains at your front door and I forgot to get rid of them. He should have insisted on scrubbing them away first thing. He could have even told the other man to do it, but he forgot. He grabbed for the hem of Toshinori's shirt, too guilt-ridden to allow himself any more contact. It was his way of punishment. Naomasa wanted nothing more than to pull his friend close and not move until 𝗫𝐻𝐬's people came to pick them up. I shouldn't have come here. It was dangerous, but I selfishly came anyway. I'm so sorry. Toshinori nodded along about the undercover mission. He winced when Naomasa mentioned the bloodstains. Not that he thought it was careless, or that resented being in danger, more that his landlord wouldn't be pleased about power washing the doorstep yet again. That's what he fixates on, more than anything else, a minor, manageable distraction, but what Naomasa said next snapped him back to reality. I shouldn't have come here. It was dangerous, but I selfishly came anyway. I'm so sorry. No, the word comes out far louder than Toshinori planned. Naomasa starts and looks up, guilty and wary, and Toshinori shakes his head to clear it. No, 𝗬𝗪. He stops, takes a slow breath. His voice is more steady when he starts again. Naomasa. The use of his friend's first name makes him flush a bit, but he pushes past it. I've told you before that year that I care about you, and that won't ever change, so. He coughs, then clears his throat. I'm serious about that. And part of caring about someone, the way I care about you, is wanting to see you safe and happy, so. As he's been talking, Toshinori moves forward, following the soft tug against his shirt. He ends up kneeling between Naomasa's legs, arms around his waist. In any other situation, Toshinori would be blushing and coughing blood at how this would look to an outsider, but he's too focused to care at the moment. You can always come to me, no matter what, even if I can't help. I can try, so. Toshinori buries his face against Naomasa's stomach. When he speaks again it's softer, muffled. When you got here last night, you asked me not to leave, to stay with you, and I did. Toshinori tightens his arms around 𝗬𝗪𝐁𝐵, pulling across the seat. Naomasa, I did. I only left to call 𝐒𝐻𝐽, so. His voice sounds small and shaky, but he can't stop it from coming out. You too? Okay, please. Toshinori gives a shivery sigh, tilting his head to look up at his friend. Stay. It was far more than he deserved, this unconditional friendship. But the way Toshinori's arms encircled him, and the gravely sound of his voice dancing over the syllables of Naomasa's name made him crave even more. He stayed. Why? Naomasa would never know. But the fact was that Toshinori stayed with him. His greedy request that put his best friend in danger, a thing he should have been hated for. And yet, there was Toshinori kneeling in front of him and asking him to stay. You're too much. Naomasa smiles, eyebrows wrinkled in such a way that gave the impression he might cry. But God, he couldn't stop smiling. I don't deserve this, or you. His heart beat against Toshinori's head, and Naomasa briefly thinks that he may just love him. How could he not? Drugs, gangs, and high tension aside, if the situation were any less dire he would have already pulled the man close and kissed him. But because it is, and because they are both waiting for an escort so they don't get shot just by walking out of the door, Naomasa settles on being selfish. His hands wrap around Toshinori's neck, pressing the former hero close, burying his face into soft fluffy hair. He smells like miso soup and laundry. And for all he was worth, Naomasa thinks it's the best scent in the world. I'll stay. For as long as you want me, I'll stay. And thank you for not leaving. He doesn't want to let go, but he also wanted to look at his friend directly. It strikes him as funny, how strange to be looking down at Toshinori instead of up. And while he can, Naomasa laughs. It took a death threat for you to call me by my name. Toshinori sighs contentedly as Naomasa folds over him, wrapping his arms more securely around the other man. For once, he's not guilty or hesitant. Naomasa was making it clear that he's just as reassured by the contact as Toshinori is. For the first time all day, Toshinori actually feels like he might be doing something right. "I'll stay. For as long as you want me, I'll stay. And thank you for not leaving." "Of course I wouldn't," Toshinori wants to say. Instead, he nudges his head against Naomasa's side, a cheap imitation of the kiss he wants to give. "It took a death threat for you to call me by my name." Toshinori tilted his head back to look at his friend in shock. His mouth opens to say that can't be true, that he's definitely called his friend by his first name at least a few times. But he's interrupted by the sound of someone knocking on the front door. Toshinori moves before Naomasa does, instinctively putting himself between his friend and any potential threats. His phone vibrates where Naomasa had dropped it in the floor. Toshinori glances at the screen and relaxes when he sees a message from 𝐈𝐧𝐭 announcing his presence. Toshinori gives Naomasa a reassuring nod as he grabs the phone from the ground. He tilted the screen so Naomasa could see the message, then tucked the phone back into his pocket. "I'm going to go let 𝐈𝐧𝐭 in and try to get some idea of what we're doing next," Toshinori says. "If you want to grab, whatever you think will be useful. Clothes, blankets, toothbrushes and stuff, I'll come find you once we're going." When Toshinori finally breaks away, he leaves an emptiness behind that Naomasa can't help but notice. He wonders just when he became so needy for his friend's attention, but decides it's better to push that to the back of his mind. Instead, Naomasa focuses himself on finding useful things, as per request. There won't be a lot to take. For people in hiding, it wouldn't be productive to keep wearing the same clothes, and he was sure a safe house would have things like blankets. Still, he looks around, picking up personal effects that would make Toshinori feel more comfortable. Toothbrush from the bathroom, underwear from the bedroom. It was the simple, familiar things that really made a difference when being forced from your home. At the last minute, he decides to grab a scarf looped haphazardly in the closet. Toshinori was always prone to getting cold, and he didn't know how long it would take to see the principal. Not forgetting the container of soup, Naomasa brings that with him to the kitchen. Was that everything? Photos, maybe, but he didn't know where something so personal would be kept. Heading to the front room, he rejoined Toshinori with the small pile of items in tow. 𝐈𝐧𝐭 was there, squatting low to inspect the window damage, expression impossible to read. Naomasa couldn't hear what the two of them were saying, their voices hushed and in deep conversation. The detective clears his throat to announce his presence. "Eraserhead, it's good to see you doing well." When Toshinori answers the door, he's relieved to see 𝐈𝐧𝐭. The feeling lasts about until 𝐈𝐧𝐭 crosses the threshold into the apartment. He glances around, raising an eyebrow in the dry way that makes Toshinori feel like he's back in middle school. His eyes cut back to Toshinori before he turns abruptly toward the center of the room, pacing to the center and then working his way around and out, noting the place of everything. He stops by the cabinet, examining the note pinned there. Toshinori hears a quiet sigh, more faintly annoyed than genuinely upset. 𝐈𝐧𝐭 starts speaking as he moves to crouch by the window, examining the pattern of the glass shards on the carpet. "How is he?" 𝐈𝐧𝐭's eyes flick to Toshinori, then back down. They're analyzing and cool, but not totally emotionless. "He's better than he was last night, anyway," says Toshinori, shrugging helplessly. 𝐈𝐧𝐭 grunts, standing to inspect the windowsill. "And you?" "Fine, of course." Toshinori moved cautiously to stand next to 𝐈𝐧𝐭, tilting his head to examine the damage. "Better now that I know he's safe. His relationship with the landlord will probably be about as shattered as the window. At this point, well, he guesses that his lease was almost up anyway." 𝐈𝐧𝐭 frowns seriously down at the glass on the sill, apparently mulling something over. He abruptly turns to face Toshinori, who instinctively takes a step back at his expression. "What are you going to do?" 𝐈𝐧𝐭 asks, his dull monotone not quite matching up with the intense aura. Toshinori blinks, uncertain. "Please tell me you aren't saying what I think you're saying." He thinks. "I thought that was up for discussion," he says, and 𝐈𝐧𝐭 rolls his eyes. "You know that's not what I meant," he says, crossing his arms. Toshinori mimics his posture unconsciously, straightening his back. "I don't think there's anything to do," he says, a bit of frost in his voice. "I've told you before that 𝗬𝐭𝐚𝐲 and I are just friends." "I know." Despite 𝐈𝐧𝐭's dry tone, Toshinori knows that the words are supposed to be soothing. Still, he feels nettled. He's always shut down this topic quickly enough that he's thought it was clear he was uncomfortable with it. "There isn't anything like that. I mean, between us, there isn't, I know." 𝐈𝐧𝐭 shoots Toshinori a sour look, crouching back down. There's a few seconds of silence, while Toshinori stews, tapping his foot in agitation. Does he, though? 𝐈𝐧𝐭 was looking up at Toshinori through the fringe of his bangs, eyes heavy. Before Toshinori can even start to respond to that, he hears the sound of a threat clearing softly behind him. He barely manages to avoid spinning around, and he gives 𝐈𝐧𝐭 an irritated look as the man snorts quietly. "Eraserhead." It's good to see you doing well. Naomasa comes to stand close to Toshinori. Though it's less than there would be between them in any other situation, the space between them feels too much. Toshinori shifts till their shoulders and arms brush. He feels the prickle of Aizawa's gaze, and he stares the man down defiantly. Even though not 5 minutes ago the two of them sat much closer than they were standing now, having Aizawa's steady gaze run over the way their shoulders touched was unnerving. I wish I could say the same to you, but the only time we seem to meet is when something's gone wrong. Naomasa would love to deny the observation, but of course Aizawa was telling the truth. The only difference between then and now was who was wearing the bandages. Aizawa's gaze shifted to the personal effects sitting in Naomasa's hands. I take it you're ready to go, then? He directed them to the door, Naomasa in the middle of the two heroes. Although Naomasa understood why, it was difficult to get used to the role of protected rather than protector. An unmarked car was parked just outside, waiting. It sparks to life once they get settled. Their arduous journey only beginning. We'll be taking the long route, so rest while you can. 𝗧𝗪 will be meeting us at your temporary new home. There's a hint of amusement in his voice that Naomasa picks up on, but doesn't quite understand. He looks to Toshinori hoping for an answer, but the small huff his friend gives in response is equally as confusing. Already exhausted, it's easier to not think at all. Naomasa sighs, hand running through his short black hair in frustration. Sleep was calling for him. And it's obviously the best option right now, but he still couldn't relax. He felt like he should be the one on watch. It was his job to. His hand curled around a loose fold of Toshinori's shirt, lightly tugging at the soft fabric. It's a subtle movement, the shirt large enough to spill over the seat, so Naomasa only had to keep his hands next to him. But it's enough. His tension lessened. And it's easier now to close his eyes. The lull of the car over pavement makes a unique melody. And before he knows it, Tsukachi Naomasa is asleep. Naomasa's head thumped against the headrest of the car and starts to tilt toward the window. The suspension on the car is good enough that there aren't too many bumps. But Naomasa needs his rest, and, as Toshinori has always known him to be a light sleeper, it only makes sense for him to tug Naomasa's sleeve until the man tilts toward him and rest Naomasa's head against his shoulder. Right. Toshinori refuses to meet Aizawa's eyes in the mirror, instead wrapping a steadying arm around Naomasa. He stares determinedly out the window, to avoid any unnecessary eye contact. He knows Aizawa isn't tactless enough to talk when someone else is sleeping. He trusts you, you know. Well, so much for that. I do, replies Toshinori, deliberately not turning to face Aizawa. He knows his friend is perceptive enough to pick up on his not interested in talking signal. But apparently whatever's gotten into Aizawa overrides what little exists of his usual social grace. He cares about you, too. Toshinori's eyes snap to the mirror, but Aizawa is focused on the road. Toshinori opens his mouth to say something he doesn't know. An objection, acknowledgement, to tell Aizawa to just be quiet. Whatever it is, it gets cut through by Aizawa's sharp tone. I'm not stupid, Yagi. And neither are you, however much you acted. Toshinori huffs, indignant, but Aizawa isn't done. You got lucky this time, the two of you. But recovery girl showed me the medical records, just in case anything happened. Your detective is very skilled, but it's stupid to deny the fact that skill wasn't enough this time. Aizawa's hands flex on the wheel, and Toshinori remembers the weeks after USJ when they were covered in bandages. Lucky, Aizawa wasn't wrong. He rarely is with this kind of thing, despite the disinterest he shows in it. Naomasa had been. Toshinori's arm instinctively tightens around the man, and he stirs slightly, sighing as he settles. Toshinori barely resists the urge to press a kiss to the top of Naomasa's head. If Aizawa hadn't been there, maybe, well, maybe not. There's a limit to how far you can stretch platonic affection. And Toshinori's pretty sure he's towing that fine line just as he is right now. Toshinori realizes that Aizawa's eyes are still flickering between him and the road. He gives the man a helpless look, and if he wasn't worried about jostling Naomasa, he'd shrug. What do you think I should do, then? He asks, and sighs as quietly as he can. It's not like I can protect him anymore. Today had been a clear reminder of that. Toshinori's selfish panic and, well, selfishness in general, they showcase that as well as anything. And he knows full well what Aizawa is trying to nudge him toward. He'd always laughed off his friend's insinuations about the relationship between him and Naomasa. Looking at his actions today, it's pretty obvious that even if Aizawa was more right than Toshinori cares to admit, a closer relationship with Toshinori is the worst thing that could happen right now. In the mirror, Aizawa rolls his eyes. For a second, Toshinori thinks he's about to be chastised again. But Aizawa just settles back into the driver's seat and focuses on the road. So instead he lets the steady flash of street lamps in the car window lull him into drowsiness, then over the edge towards sleep. His head slumps to rest on the headrest, and his fingers idly pluck at the loose fabric of Naomasa's borrowed shirt. He's almost totally asleep when Aizawa speaks again. You can, he says quietly. His eyes are fixed on the road when Toshinori glances up, And they don't move to the rear view mirror at all as Aizawa frowns seriously out the windshield. You can still protect him. Isn't that what you're doing right now? After last night's disrupted rest and today's emotional drain, Toshinori's too tired to really parse what Aizawa means by that. He hums lowly to let the underground hero know he was heard. Then Toshinori drops his head to rest on Naomasa's, tugging the man closer against him. He distinctly hears a snort as he does, but he's asleep before he can bother with a retort. When you get so used to a movement, the instant it stops, the effect is jarring. So as the car finally made it to their destination, Naomasa awoke when the rumble of the engine ceased. Once again he wakens to clothes warmth. They must have shifted sometime during their nap. His head was tucked under a mess of blonde, and his hand was circled loosely around a slim wrist. If this kept up, the detective wasn't sure he would be able to sleep without Toshinori by his side. We're here. Aizawa turned around to look at the two men in his backseat. He seems tired, a reasonable assumption for someone who most likely drove half the night in an attempt to shake any followers. The words caused Toshinori to stir, and they reluctantly get out of the car. The apartment looks small from the outside. No defining features to speak of. It's also taller than the surrounding buildings. And if Naomasa had to guess, their accommodations would be on a higher floor to keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. For purposes of a getaway, the train station is only 2 blocks away, all in all an excellent location, as expected of UA. 3rd floor, 355. Slipping a set of keys into Toshinori's hands, Aizawa stays next to the driver's door, his job now finished. Only a few nods are exchanged instead of goodbyes, and a thin hand reaches out to stop Naomasa before he leaves. Aizawa's brows are creased, unreadable expression in his red-tinged eyes. Detective 𝗧𝗵𝗲, you don't have to say yes. Naomasa jumps a little at the edge in Aizawa's voice, but the man is already letting go before Toshinori notices the delay. The parting words were troubling, so he makes sure to identify all the entrances and exits on the way to their new home. When Toshinori unlocks the door, 𝗫𝗠 is already there, lounging peacefully in the small living room. Right on time, though I can't imagine there would be much traffic at this hour. Please, sit and make yourselves comfortable. I apologize that there's no time to settle, but I'll get right down to the heart of the matter. I have a difficult request. The plan is almost set, he explains. The wide network of eyes that the Shiai were so proud of would be their undoing. The mind-reading quirk user was actually registered in the system, an ordinary woman that fit Naomasa's description, hiding in plain sight as a simple office worker. 𝗫𝗠 flips a small photo from his pocket. That's her. Naomasa shudders, hands subconsciously covering the shallow cuts that remained of his wounds. With her, we are going to pull the head of the Shiai from the woodworks. But, in order to do that, we also need you, detective. I need to ask you to put yourself into harm's way again. Naomasa's heart skipped. Now he understood Aizawa's comment. It was only right that he finished this job. Not only would a dangerous group be erased from the streets, but Toshinori would be safe to go back home. On the other hand, he promised. The thought of Toshinori on his knees, asking him to be safe, asking him to stay, pulled at his heart. He was supposed to protect people. But what happened if in protecting his best friend, he hurts him? The more 𝗫𝗠 talks, the more Toshinori wants to protest. It's not that he can't see that the plan is good. 𝗫𝗠 has backups for every situation or misfortune that Toshinori could possibly think of, and then some. He continually stresses that this is a choice, that Naomasa was in no way obligated or even really expected to participate. Yes, his presence would make this much easier, but not so much so that it's an absolute necessity. Still, as much as Toshinori would trust Yui's principle with his life, and he has, on multiple occasions, done just that, and as much as he knew this wasn't his choice to make, and that he doesn't have any right to impose, he wishes that he could be alone with Naomasa again, and talk about this without anyone watching. He repeatedly has to stop himself from reaching out to put an arm around Naomasa's shoulders, or his waist, or to wind their fingers together. The thought of his friend throwing himself willingly into danger again, while he's still recovering from his first round with this opponent, it makes Toshinori suddenly so much more appreciative for all the patience and support throughout Toshinori's heroic career. It's not that he hadn't thought about the effects it would have on his loved ones, but rather that being in the same situation gives him a better understanding at exactly how helpless someone in this situation feels. The room was quiet, and Toshinori realizes that 𝗫𝗠 has finished talking. Both he and Naomasa are looking at Toshinori, obviously waiting for a response. Toshinori hesitates, biting his lip hard before he speaks. It's your choice, he says. No matter which way you go from here, I'll support you, so please don't worry about me. It's not technically a lie. He would support his friend no matter what. But it's not the whole truth, either. Toshinori forces a smile, forces himself not to say what he wants to. Don't go, don't put yourself in danger. Unbidden and unwanted. A third, selfish though 𝗧𝗧𝗏. Don't do this to me. Without needing to touch, Naomasa could tell that this was killing Toshinori. There was no doubt in his mind that Toshinori would never, ever stop him from doing something. But the look on his face, the cracked smile that looks nothing close to his real one, he couldn't fake the warmth that emanates from his genuine happiness. Naomasa was only going to break that smile further. I realize I'm not a hero like you or Eraserhead are. The things I can do are severely limited. The words come slowly, an apology to Toshinori more than anything else. You won't be able to go home, you know. I've uprooted you from your job. You have your students to think about. Midoriya to think about. You can't stay here, Toshinori. Not forever. The 𝐎𝐩𝐢 are dangerous, I'm well aware. That's why, if I can do something to help, I will. Naomasa couldn't look his friend in the eye, afraid of seeing what this kind of hurt would do to him. He'd never broken a promise before, and this one was the most important he ever made. The principal says his thanks, promising to call in the next 2 days with an update. Until then, they were to stay here. His choice of words places a guilt in Naomasa's heart. Stay. If only he could. Toshinori walked 𝗫𝗠 robotically to the door, nodding goodbye absent-mindedly. His head was still spinning with a mic of panic, anger and doubt. He barely hears 𝗫𝗠 tells him that they'll be gathering people to work with over the 2-day grace period they'd been given. Tomorrow I'll be sending over a poison and chem expert. They're a bit, how do you say it, original. But we'll need some way to speed Detective 𝗬𝐭𝐻's recovery and immunize our team to the 𝐎𝐲's drug, so. 𝗫𝗠 smiled up at Toshinori, expression serene. If he noticed how distant Toshinori was compared to his usual bright attitude, he doesn't comment. The two bid each other farewell for the time being, and Toshinori watches as 𝗫𝗠 disappears down the apartment building's hall. He closes the door, and notes the subtle click of the lock. He keeps staring absently at the door. He braces one hand against it, leaning his full weight on it, testing how it held up. His head feels kind of like it's been stuffed full of cotton, emotional numbness from the whiplash today's given him. Without intending to, his knees bend, and he slides gradually to rest on the floor. He shuffles so he can lean his back against it, staring blankly at the ceiling while he thinks. I'll stay. For as long as you want me, I'll stay. I don't deserve this, or you. Does he, though? You can still protect him. That's what you're doing right now, isn't it? Toshinori wanted to laugh, but he doesn't want Naomasa to find him like this. The last thing he needs to do is waste energy worrying about someone who's perfectly capable of taking care of themselves. Toshinori tries to force himself to stand. He should go reheat the food he'd made earlier, and make sure Naoma gets to bed. It's more true than ever that he'll need all of his strength, but Toshinori's limbs feel like wet cement. The most he can do is twitch his fingers. He can feel his lips curl in a self-disgusted snarl. Pathetic. He curls up around himself, balancing his crossed arms on his knees and hiding his face in them. He could feel blood starting to creep up his throat, and he clears his throat, stubbornly refusing to give in to a full coughing fit. He digs his fingernails into the soft skin of his upper arms, grimacing hard enough to bare his teeth. This isn't helping. A logical part of him insists. He's not doing anything by sitting on the floor stewing in self-pity. He'll feel better if he gets up and does something. Toshinori's too tired to really argue with it. It feels like it takes a Herculean effort, but he finally forces himself to his feet. He makes his way back to the small living room, where Naomasa was still sitting on the couch. He looks up when Toshinori enters. Guilty doesn't really cover the range of emotion on his face. Toshinori feels a stab of pity, as much as it hurts that Naomasa was leaving so soon after promising to stay. Toshinori knows it's not out of faithlessness. And really, after everything he'd put his friend through over the years, could he really complain? Toshinori pads to the couch, then slumps against Naomasa's side. He buries his face against the other man's neck, winding his arms around his waist. He can't actually find the energy to speak just yet, so he twists his fingers in Naomasa's shirt and hopes he understands. I'm sorry, Toshinori. The apology wavers, and Naomasa can only sink into his embrace with eyes shut tight. His fingers brush through Toshinori's hair, hoping that the soothing strokes can give him some sort of peace. 2 days. That was all the time they had together, and although he didn't plan on dying, it was still a real possibility. If every second of that time was spent entwined like this with Toshinori, it would have been just fine. He couldn't bear to let go. I hope you understand. Naomasa rests his head in a mess of blonde hair, murmuring his regrets about breaking his promise. It won't be like before. I'm not alone this time. I'll come back, okay? Tilting Toshinori's head up to face him, Naomasa smiles kindly. It's as much of a promise he can give, that he'll do everything in his power to come home safe. To Toshinori, safe. Naomasa blushes when his stomach growls, interrupting the moment between them. The thoughts in his head, the words he wanted to say. Perhaps another time. Dropping his hands from where they rested on Toshinori's cheeks, he suggests they eat. Toshinori eats, only half paying attention to the food he puts in his mouth. Naomasa tries to speak a few times, but gives up when he receives only monosyllabic answers. Afterward, though, he bumps arms with Naomasa as they do the dishes. Toshinori waits till he knows the detective is listening, then speaks. "I trust you. You know that, right?" Naomasa hesitates, then nods quickly. Toshinori sighs, then nods. He's too tired for another soul-bearing talk, and he still has no idea what he really wants to say. "Don't go. Don't leave me." "Why?" Toshinori eventually just drifts off to take a shower and finds that the warm water brings him back to himself. He tries to plan his next step as he dries himself off, but finds that even with a clearer mind, it's impossible to see a way forward. He wanders out of the room clad in only a towel. He heads to the bedroom and finds clothes in the dresser that, miraculously, fit. He has to laugh at the amount of effort 𝗫𝗠 puts into his plans. Naomasa enters just as Toshinori pulls his shirt over his head. It's a bit tighter than what he'd choose, but he guesses he doesn't need the fabric he used for transformation. He gives his friend a small smile as an apology, ducking his head. "Tired?" he asks, voice low. Naomasa was trying. He was at a loss of what to do. Everything he said, compliments on the food, little comments on how he hoped this poison expert wasn't too eccentric, they were all met with a dull look and a vague sound of agreement. Tired? Yes, Naomasa thinks. Tired is an understatement. He's emotionally exhausted. The words themselves don't come out. He can only sigh in relief. "You're talking to me again." One small word gave him such reassurance. Searching for something to say, Naomasa smiled at the new shirt. How the principal got clothing in Toshinori's size so quickly he'll never know, but the style suited him well. "You should think about wearing tailored things more often. It looks good." Glancing down at his own borrowed clothes, he realizes that he could probably change as well. There's a small part of him that doesn't really want to, though. Even a second of silence is getting to him, afraid that Toshinori might have gone back to being quiet. He came here for a reason, didn't he? To make sure they were okay. "Toshi, you don't hate me?" The pleasant smile drops a bit, Naomasa unable to ask. "Yeah, I'm a bit tired." "You're talking to me again." More than Naomasa's expression, it's his tone and the way he relaxes. Losing tension Toshinori hadn't even noticed he'd been hiding in his body. That tells Toshinori he's fucked up again. Before he can even start to apologize, though, Naomasa speaks again. There's a nervous quality to his voice that tells Toshinori that this sudden chattiness is a lifeline for him, right now. "You should think about wearing tailored things more often. It looks good." At any other time, the words would have Toshinori flushed and coughing, but right now, they're pretty much disregarded in favor of closer examination of Naomasa. Toshinori steps closer, one hand starting to raise to cup the man's face. "Toshi, you don't." It's far too easy to fill in the rest of that sentence. Toshinori has enough self-disgust bottles in his skinny frame to fuel a nation. The only real upside is that it makes it easy to recognize in others. It also gives Toshinori an admittedly sketchy framework to brace against for reassuring his friend right now. Naomasa looks up as he finished speaking, and starts at how close Toshinori's gotten. Toshinori waits until his friend relaxes, then drops his hand to rest against Naomasa's shoulder, thumb just brushing his neck. "Suka, Naomasa," Toshinori says, voice low. He feels a slight shiver race through his friend, and he waits for it to stop before he continues. "You said earlier that the things you could do are limited, that you weren't a hero like Aizawa, or me." The last part gave Toshinori pause. He still had a hard time reconciling with the fact that the people who know about his smaller form still consider him a hero, but now wasn't the time. It's true that you may not have the ability for fight like Aizawa can, or like I used to, but that doesn't make what you've accomplished any less amazing, you know." He stroked his thumb against the line of Naomasa's throat, sighing. "As I said earlier, it's not at all like I think you're weak, but after what's happened, I don't think it's out of line for me to be worried, you know." Toshinori sighs heavily, slumping slightly. His hand tightens around Naomasa's shoulder, then releases gradually. "Sorry, I won't ask you not to go, because I think I can understand why you think you need to do this, but..." The hand that isn't wrapped around Naomasa's shoulder comes up to cover Naomasa's mouth as he hangs his head. He can't force the feelings he has into words, no matter how hard he tries. Toshinori finally sighs and steps back, giving a faint, worn-out smile. "I'll think about what I want to do about this after I've rested more, so, please be patient." Then Toshinori gestures to the bed, resigned. "I'm pretty sure I didn't see a futon or anything else to sleep on, so, we're probably going to have to share. If you're okay with that, obviously." At any other time he'd be mortally embarrassed. But he's exhausted, and he spent last night and most of today curled around Naomasa anyway, so it's hard to work up the energy. He stifles a yawn and sways in place while he waits for Naomasa to respond. Every movement, every touch. His heart beat loudly in his throat, right where Toshinori kept brushing his thumb. He called him amazing. That was one skipped beat. He was worried, that was the other. Was Toshinori even aware of how much their sudden closeness was affecting him? Please, he thought. Please don't worry. But that's not fair, he knows. How many times had Naomasa worried, holding his tongue? He only nods when Toshinori mentions bed. Too tired to care that the apartment only accommodated one. His friend looked exhausted, so Naomasa helps him before he sways the wrong way, hand on his back and guiding him to the mattress. There is only a moment of hesitation before Naomasa climbs into bed next to him. It was the third time they would sleep next to one another, but somehow it seemed more intimate when an actual bed was involved. The covers were hardly pulled up over Toshinori's shoulder before he was out like a light. Unlike the man next to him, 𝗧𝗏𝗁 was used to very little sleep, too many hours poring over cases long into the night, only to rise early so he can review them again. The hour or two from the car was enough to keep him going for quite a while. Turning so he faced his bedmate, Naomasa sighed. He didn't know what tomorrow would reveal, or what ideas Toshinori would get into his head. His hand rises to smooth the stray hairs that stick out oddly from Toshinori's head. If he was going to be stuck awake, occupying himself like this wouldn't be too terrible. Right, it wasn't something a friend would do, he was pretty sure of that. He was already hoping too much every time Toshinori came close, shivering when he called him by name. G-Night, Toshi. He scooted closer, resting his head as close as possible without waking the other man up.